We're going to start a new series today, and this will be the second or third time that we've looked at a text or a concept or a sermon by Dr. Gaffney, Dr. Wilda Gaffney. Dr. Gaffney is our Tippy speaker in March. So she is coming, and we normally wouldn't spend quite so much time getting ready for a Tippy speaker, but this is one of those Tippy speakers we don't want to miss the opportunity to take advantage of. Dr. Gaffney is a gift to the Episcopal Church, to the Christian community more largely. But Dr. Gaffney talks about the Bible and about the church and about the faith in ways that are challenging. So I kind of want us to be ready to meet that challenge. So we're going to do 2 weeks on the Womanist Midrash. If you're just walking in the door, there are handouts by the coffee. Get a handout. We are light on handouts, so you might need to share with your neighbor. But we're going to look at Womanist Midrash this week and next week. And then we've got some other things coming up during Advent. And we're going to come back and do 2 more weeks on Womanist Midrash in the new year. But let's start with a prayer. And instead of a prayer today, I'd like to do a canticle. And it's the canticle that's at the top of your handout. Those of you looking online, hopefully you can see that on the screen. This is not from Dr. Gaffney. It's actually from a liturgical resource published by the Episcopal Church, Enriching Our Worship. And this is Canticle R, called A Song of True Motherhood. It's a text attributed to Julian of Norwich. Let's read that canticle as our opening prayer. Let's read it together, either on the screen or at the top of your handout. God chose to be our mother in all things, and so made the foundation of his work most humbly and most pure in the Virgin's womb. God, the perfect wisdom of all, arrayed himself in this humble place. Christ came in our poor flesh to share a mother's care. Our mothers bear us for pain and for death. Our true mother, Jesus, bears us for joy and endless life. Christ carried us within him in love and travail until the full time of his passion. And when all was completed and he had carried us so for joy, still all this could not satisfy the power of his wonderful love. All that we owe is redeemed in truly loving God, for the love of Christ works in us. Christ is the one whom we love. Sorry about that. So we're going to be looking at Womanist Midrash, but before we look at Womanist Midrash, we need to talk about what is Midrash. Did any of you by chance grow up in a home, a Jewish home, where you went to synagogue on a regular basis? Anybody grow up in a Jewish community? Midrash is something not unfamiliar to Christians, but largely unfamiliar to Christians over the last 1,800 years. So, 1,700 years for most of Christian history. We kind of stopped doing this. After the desert mothers and fathers came out of the desert. We stopped listening to what those strange mystics would write. A couple of them, like Julian of Norwich, would do some of this work. But look at what I've given you there on the screen. It's not on your handout, but look on the screen. And this is from Gaffney's book. And this is the book that we're basing our conversation on today. It's a book she wrote and published in the 80s, if you can believe it, way back in the 80s. A Womanist Midrash, a reintroduction to the women of the Torah and the throne. And this is from her book. Let me read what's on the screen about what is Midrash. In Jewish and sacred literature, Midrash is the primary rabbinic term for exegesis. In biblical Hebrew, the verb derish means to seek. Later, it would become specifically to exegete. Midrash is its derived noun. Traditional Midrash is also mystical, imaginative, revelatory, and above all, religious. Midrash interprets not only the text before the reader, but also the text behind and beyond the text, and the text between the lines of the text. In rabbinic thinking, each letter and the spaces between the letters are available for interpretive work. In the Western Christian tradition, we're really good at exegesis. Before I write a sermon, I read the text. I read the text in the Greek or the Hebrew. I look at what commentators have said about what the meanings of the words are. If the words occur elsewhere in the Bible, I go and look and see how the words have been used. I look at how over 2,000 years or longer Theologians have been interpreting the text. I look at allusions that are made. I look at some architectural or historical record to try to get a sense of what this would have sounded like. And then and only then would I begin to write a sermon. Exegesis is really familiar to us. In the Jewish tradition, Midrash sort of takes the place of exegesis. It is an exploration of the text, but unlike that Western Christian tradition, which seeks to understand sort of the details and the specificity and the historicity, Midrash is actually, as I think Gaffney says really well, a way to interpret not only the text itself, what's behind the text, what's between the text, what else is being done. And I think a clarifying statement is what we see in the second definition that I offer. What is womanist Midrash? Some of you know that womanist theology, not just theology, but womanism is the branch of feminist thought or feminist theology in this case that is particularly addresses issues of women of color. And so this is what Gaffney says is womanist Midrash. Womanist Midrash is a set of interpretive practices, including translation, exegesis, and biblical interpretation that attends to the marginalized characters in biblical narratives, especially women and girls, intentionally including and centering on non-Israelite peoples and enslaved persons. As the description of this class was published in the newsletter, there are lots of characters in the Bible that we don't often focus on. As Gaffney notes in her book, there are hundreds, about 110 women who are named in the Hebrew Scriptures. There are many other hundreds of women who are explicit in the text, but who are not named, the nameless women whom we encounter. But as Gaffney puts it, there are thousands and thousands, countless tens of thousands of other women who aren't even depicted in the text, but without whom the text would be meaningless. The other women of Israel who made the journey from Egypt into the wilderness and into the land of promise. The other women who were taking their water to the well, not just the Samaritan woman who isn't named either. So a womanist midrash is an interpretive practice that seeks to bring our attention to those whom the text, and especially the lectionary and preachers of the text, often ignored, trusting not only that it's worth hearing or imagining those holy stories and their holy witness, but also that our appreciation of who God is and how God is at work in the saving work of the world will be enriched by that exploration. The last bit of introduction that I want to give before we dig in is to read this bit. I'm going to make the white space disappear. To read, how does one do womanist midrash? And you'll be disappointed because the answer is you can't really just do it. And I'll read from Gaffney. Given that womanism is as much perspectival as ideological and phenomenological as much as analytical, womanism resists methodology as the category is articulated and wielded in male stream and other traditions of biblical interpretation, including feminist interpretations. I have great difficulty with the notion that methodology functions as a recipe that, when followed, will yield a womanist produce. As much difficulty as I have reproducing my grandmother's sweet potato pudding recipe. Perhaps the theological equivalent of reverse engineering a recipe is praxis. Praxis is the practice of an art or skill, best supplemented with reflection that leads to more practice in an action-reflection cycle. Questions that emerge from womanist praxis are questions that anyone can ask and commitments that womanists bring to the text that many share. Some of those questions and commitments are, who is speaking and or active? Where are the women and girls? What are they doing and what are their names? When women or other marginalized characters speak and act, whose interests are they serving? Who and where are the characters without which the story could not have unfolded as articulated? What are the power dynamics in the narrative? What are the ethical implications of the text when read from the perspective of the dominant character or characters? What are the ethical implications of previous, especially traditional, readings of the text for black women? How have black women historically related to the text? In what ways to the contemporary circumstance of black women, do readers shape new and renewed interpretations? How do the values articulated in the text and its interpretation affect the well-being of the communities that black women inhabit? How does or can this text function as scripture for black women? Who is, and what is the construction of, God in the text? Is she, he, it, invested in the flourishing of black women, our families, and our worlds? Gaffney asked those questions, and I promise she will ask those questions when she is here as our Tippy speaker in March. We're going to turn to the text itself. I don't know if we'll get done with two different examples of the text, but I've given you two examples of the text. But before we look at the text, thoughts, questions, reflections, observations, comments about Womanist Midrash, or the work that we're going to do today and next week. Any thoughts about that? Do you hear anything that challenges you that you want to name? Anything that encourages you that you want to name? And I could use some help with the microphone. Would you help, Kristen? Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. If you've got a comment or a question, share it with the microphone so that not only we can hear it, but those watching online can hear it as well. Any comments, questions, concerns? Yeah, Trent.
Well, the whole emphasis on praxis and engaging in praxis reminds me of liberation theology and the importance not just of head stuff, but of engaging experientially as part of understanding.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. What else? What else would you comment on or seize on or highlight for us? Challenges? Encouragements? You know, I've said it before, there are no white people in the Bible. You've heard me say that before. There are no white people in the Bible, front to finish. There are no people we would think of as white, European white people in the Bible. And yet, the way we receive the text of the Bible is almost always delivered either directly or indirectly through white voices and white experience. That's a big gap. And we have to be intentional about not only recognizing the gap, but even beginning to close or reverse that gap. And I'm grateful that Gaffney does that. If you want to buy this book, it's a great text. You'll see as we read from it, it's not like a text. It's not a story to be read from front to back. It's more like an encyclopedia. It wouldn't work really well for a book study. Like we thought about doing a book study with this text in anticipation of Dr. Gaffney's arrival, but it just doesn't work like that. It's more like an encyclopedia. And I was a weird kid who liked reading the encyclopedia, but I didn't get very far. But this is more, it's fun to kind of jump around and sort of read different stories, though the whole text I commend to you. Well, let's look at the text. This week, we're going to look at Torah women. And next week, we're going to look at throne women. So this week, we're going to look at women from the first 5 books of the Bible. And next week, we're going to look at women from the stories of Saul, David, Solomon, and the other monarchy. So let's start with the biblical text first, and then we'll read some of what Gaffney writes about it. Who would read for us, please, using the microphone, Exodus chapter 1, verses 4 through 22. Who might read that bit for us, pretty please? Thank you, Marthy.
Thanks. Four through 21.
22, all the way
22,
to the end of the
okay.
reading. Yep.
So this is Exodus chapter 1, verses 4 through 22. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, And the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live."
Thank you. Turn to the second part of the handout, and you'll see the sideways text where it says Shiphrah and Puah. Would someone read for us the first two paragraphs, the full paragraphs, the one that starts Shiphrah and Puah are described in Exodus? And would you read all the way through the italicized text at the bottom of that page, and then also the italicized text at the top of the next page, but stop after you finish the italicized text? Who would read for us that bit on what's labeled pages 89 and 90? Who might read that for us, please? Thank you, Ray, in the back.
This is where it starts. Shiphrah and Puah call all the birthed women to assemble.
Nope. Start with Shiphrah and Puah are described in Exodus 1:15 on page 89.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Oh, Shiphrah and Puah are described in Exodus 1:15 and following as Hebrew birth women. Migaladot ha-Ivriot. It appears they are Hebrew women themselves rather than Egyptian women or women from some other community who provide midwifery services for the Israelites. Shiphrah's name is based on a Semitic language root, shef-ba-ra, to be beautiful, or to be pleasing in Aramaic. The word sapphire may be related. Puah's name is also attested as a Semitic name. Given their presentation, we can read Shiphrah and Puah as the mothers or heads of the Israelite midwifery guild. It seems incredible that just two women are responsible for attending all the births of the Hebrew people, a people who are described in Exodus 1:7 as filling the land. In a surreal tableau, Shiphrah and Puah find themselves in the presence of the unnamed Pharaoh of the Exodus, who in Exodus 1:16 commands them to kill every male baby they deliver on the birthing stools, that is, before presenting him to his mother. One can only imagine what that encounter was like. Using my sanctified imagination, I see them both maintaining their calm, showing proper respect in every way, as though they were seasoned diplomats and courtiers.
Keep going, all the way through the italicized text.
Okay. And after the meeting with the Pharaoh, Shiphrah and Puah call all the birthing women to assemble, telling their overseers they are passing on Pharaoh's instructions. One Egyptian lingers longer than the others. Puah shoos him out with the ancient womanist refrain, "This is women's business." He leaves. Hundreds of women come to the place of Shiphrah's tent. Many bring daughters, granddaughters, and nieces whom they are apprenticing in the profession. Some are pregnant, others are nursing. It takes more than a day for everyone to gather, eat, and rest from their journeys. And there is talk, shop talk, women's words. Shared experiences and new techniques. Herbs to stop bleeding, herbs to bring on labor, teas to increase milk production, ways to limit pregnancies. Finally, Shiphrah speaks. She tells them Pharaoh's words. The women gasp. Some mutter. Some shout. Some of the children are frightened. Shiphrah and Puah shush them and call for calm. Shiphrah begins to prophesy. God has brought our people a mighty long way, and I don't believe God has brought us this far to leave us. Do not fear this Pharaoh or his warriors, nor his war horses, nor his chariots. God will blow them away like smoke in the wind. In our days, before our eyes, God will break the back of Egypt and wash away its might. God will raise up one of our sons to lead us and all our children out of this house of slavery. Our hands and our wombs do God's work. We will deliver the deliverer. We will keep him safe until the day that God calls him to lead us to freedom. We shall receive our freedom, dancing to woman's song if we trust in the mighty power of Shaddai, who drew us from her holy womb, whose spirit covers the earth. Shiphrah takes her seat. Puah speaks. Trust in God, whose name is holy. That is what we shall do. Deliver the babies. Hide as many of the boys as you can. Raise others as girls. Do not worry about the Egyptians. They will not come house to check on women. They cannot imagine that we would defy the Pharaoh, whom they revere as a living God. The women leave the convocation of birthing women. Days, weeks, then months go by. Pharaoh is too busy to think about the Hebrew birthing women. Someone mentions that the Hebrew people are still growing in spite of the Pharaoh's commandment. He summons them back to explain themselves.
Thank you. What do you notice? What do you like? I mean, we probably don't read a lot of Midrash, right? We don't read a lot of this kind of writing. How do you receive it? Is this fun? Is it strange? Is it challenging? Is it encouraging? How do you hear these words that Gaffney has offered in her sanctified imagination, to use that phrase? How do you hear this? What's it like to hear these words? And if you've got a question or comment, raise your hand high so that Kristen can bring you the microphone. Yeah, thank you, Adam, right behind you.
It's radical.
It's radical?
Yeah. They're talking about radical political stuff.
Yeah, thank you. What else? Yep, raise the baby boys as girls. Yep, absolutely. Ray's got a comment.
Men don't really understand the world of women.
Men don't understand the world of women. Yeah, thank you. What else do you notice? What else hits you in this text? What would we know about Shiphrah and Puah without stories like this? Not just this story. Dr. Gaffney's not the first person to imagine something about Shiphrah and Puah, but without any imagination, if the only thing we were allowed to think about Shiphrah and Puah was the biblical text, the text that we've got, the text that we read earlier, what would we know about them? From the Exodus text, what would we know? Yeah, Ray?
Their instinct is to protect life.
Yep, instinct to protect life, which maybe we would say is indicative of a midwife, right? To ask a midwife to kill a child is to ask a midwife to do the very thing that a midwife is not to do, can't do, is designed not to do, is called not to do, the opposite of it. Yeah. What else? What else would we know about Shiphrah and Puah? Raise your hand, Marthy, up front. Yep, thank you.
They're sort of diplomats. They're like people who are trying to get by in a horrible situation, whatever it may be, and they're just being as careful and also brave, I think. Yeah. They say, that, the Pharaoh says to them, "Why have you done this and let the male children live?" And the midwives say, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and they give birth before the midwife gets there."
Yeah.
So kind of implying, we're different from you. These babies are born quick and, they happen before we get there. That's why we don't know.
Yeah.
So
notice, I'm going to build on that. And notice at the bottom of page 90 and onto the top of 91, we didn't read it, but let me read at the bottom of 90 and onto the top of 91. Hand that microphone back to Kristen. This is speaking of Shiphrah and Puah, they use the Pharaoh's cultural bias against him. In Exodus 1:19, they say, "The Hebrew women are brutish, animalistic, chayoth, not refined like Egyptian women. Their babies just plop out of them." In other words, the word chayoth occurs only in this place. However, it is a homophone for and likely related to the noun chaya, which is a wild animal. So they're using language to say, these Hebrew women, they're like wild animals. They're having babies and they're picking them up. I don't have time. They're not as dignified and refined as an Egyptian woman. So they're playing. They're smart. Yeah. Follow up from Marthy.
That sounds to me like the way people have spoken about women of color. These people are just animals.
Yeah.
They don't need the kindness or the care or the medicine or whatever.
Sure. And these women of color are using that trope to actually subvert Pharaoh's plans. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Praying his objectionism against him. Trent, and then to the back. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say strong, defiant, but in a shrewd way.
Yeah.
Strong, shrewd, and defiant.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, to the back.
Hi.
Hi.
What's standing out to me is this sentence where it's saying, herbs to stop bleeding, herbs to bring on labor, teas to increase milk production, and ways to limit pregnancies. So these women are prophesying, right? But they're also advocating for women's, their rights to care for birth,
Yeah.
and and pregnancies, and they're advocating while having faith in God, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, yeah, and yet
Which
reproductive freedom
finds-
is an issue that they're addressing. Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
It's an ancient issue.
Yeah,
Here,
absolutely.
So it's like that really stood out to me, is that this community of women, they have faith, but they're also supporting each other in that way. So
Yeah.
that stood out a lot.
Yeah, thank you. So go back to the biblical text and look at, I'm going to just look on the screen, I'll highlight it for you, right? So notice everything that happens in just these two verses, right? These three verses. Pharaoh says, the king, the one who is revered like a god, says to Shiphrah and Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but is it a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called them and said, why have you done this? So much happens that is not spoken, right? I mean, even without Midrash, to attempt to fully intellectualize the experience of these two women who have a name, and to recognize that somehow they get from the Pharaoh says you will kill them to we fear God so we won't do it. They get called into the Pharaoh's court to give account, and they come up with a story that gets them rewarded instead of punished. Like, those are some women I want to know. Like, I want to know them. They have a story to tell. They have a faith, a vibrant faith in the face of certain death. They defy that. There's a wonderful richness. You don't need a midrash to know that, but we need somebody to help us see it. We need somebody to help give space for that. And the beauty of this kind of midrash is that it allows these stories to come alive. Let me, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Struck me. We shall receive our freedom, dancing to woman's song, if we trust in the mighty power of Shaddai, who drew us from her holy womb, whose spirit covers the earth. What do you know about Shaddai?
Not much. Not much. Just another name for the divine. El Shaddai, like if you ever heard El Shaddai, there's a really cheesy song that was probably written in 1972. I don't know when it was. El Shaddai, it's a cheesy religious song. It's just another, I don't know much about that title. I don't know what that refers to. It might be a feminine way of describing God. I don't know what Shaddai means. I'm sorry. Yeah. Let's jump ahead. We're not going to read the whole of the story, but let's jump ahead and look at the number story. And let's just allow the story of Miriam to be interesting to us. And let's notice, I'll read a little bit from the biblical text, but I'm going to ask somebody else to read the midrash that Dr. Gaffney offers. But let me set the stage for this passage. You remember Miriam was Aaron's sister, and Miriam is a prophet. She's a prophet among Israel. She speaks with as much authority as Moses does at some point. She's the one who sings the song of Moses right after the Israelites cross the Red Sea, and the waves crash down. She's the one who sings the song about the triumph. She's the one who dances with the tambourine. So she's an important figure. But something goes amiss. And the next time after that Exodus story, the next time she shows up is here in the Numbers text. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let's read the first few verses. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. I'm going to skip down a little bit and notice the Lord shows up. And I'm going to skip down to verse 10, the second paragraph. When the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, O my Lord, do not punish us because we have done foolishly and have sinned. Let her not be as one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb. And Moses cried to the Lord, "O God, please heal her, please." Let me stop there. Who would read for us, please? And we're going to be on page, how about somebody else find it first? Page 134. When we read about Miriam's visit to the camp beyond the camp, who would read the italicized bit? Adam will. Thank you, Adam.
Starting with Miriam's visit.
Thank you. All the way through the italicized text. Thank you.
Miriam's visit to the camp beyond the camp, made of the tents of restriction and restoration, was her first visit. She had not come to the camp, as had every woman, for her monthly time of restriction and restoration, because she was in her 90s when Israel left Egypt. The other prophets and most of the priests came, most only until the next evening after making love. Some came to stay so often they might as well have had their own tents. Others visited with less frequency. Some of their leaders, priests and prophets and elders, came to stay after a death in the family, but their childbearing women came to the camp monthly and after the birth of their children, in addition to the times of their lovemaking. The elder women came after their times of lovemaking, but Miriam never took a man. She had never had need of the tents of restriction and restoration before. Miriam had been cast out as punishment for speaking out to God and Moshe over the scandal of his divorce. He had abandoned his first wife, Zipporah, and their children. After all she had done for him. She had saved his life from the hands of his own God. Her father had taught her about the God of Sinai, and she had taught Moshe, although he hadn't listened and grazed the sheep on the holy mountain. He's lucky God didn't kill him for sure. Moshe traded her in for a new woman. It wasn't Zipporah's fault she was abandoned like yesterday's garbage. And then Moshe had the nerve to try to keep up his relationship with Zipporah's own father. Well, that wouldn't last. Someone needed to tell him about himself before the other men started getting ideas. And Miriam, our prophet, got in his face and told him about himself. And then God struck her. God has always favored Moshe, just like Galit in the next tent over favors her nasty little Zvi over her sweet Nechemah. No rhyme or reason. But God immediately regretted it and took it back. But God had to save face with Moshe, who was acting all outraged, even though Miriam was telling the truth and everyone knew it. And Aaron, hiding behind her skirts the whole time, agreed with her but was afraid to say a mumbling word. Just like he's hiding in that tent over yonder. Never mind that. I wasn't supposed to say anything. You didn't hear it from me. No diseased priests in Israel's ranks. Humph. Now our Miriam, she's a real prophet. She goes to God on our behalf, and God speaks over her for us. When God comes when she pounds her drum, and when she dances, God dances with and in her. That's my kind of prophet. And she's not just hiding in her tent either. She's not afraid of picking up another kind of restriction from one of us who can never go back to the main camp, although some of the worst ones keep their distance out of respect. Some say we ought to have moved on by now, the main camp before and those of us hereafter. God and fire started to move, but a funny thing happened. Some of the women in the main camp refused to move without the prophet being gathered back in the main camp. All of the women in the tribe of Levi, Miriam's kinswomen, including all of the priest women, refused to move. The menfolk thought they could pack up the God tent without them and move ahead. Well, now they know. We'll be sorry to see her go. She is our prophet, and we are her people.
Thank you. What do you notice? What do you hear? What do you enjoy about that? What challenges you about that? It's a challenging text. It's okay to say, I don't like that. That's confusing. I don't want to hear that. That's okay. But what's your engagement with the text? What would you note of the text? As y'all are thinking about that, look at on the screen at the end of the biblical text, right? So Miriam was shut outside the camp 7 days, and the people did not set on the march until Miriam was brought in again. After that, the people set out and camped in the wilderness of Paran, right? It's a tiny detail in the text, but Miriam was sent out of the camp because of her leprosy. She needed 7 days to be purified. and nobody bothered to march again. They all waited for Miriam. So Miriam's criticism of Moses got her turned into a leprous individual. And yet, even though she had criticized the leader of Israel, Israel refused to march until she was with them. They weren't going to leave her behind. That's a beautiful detail that someone with the depth of experience, knowledge, insight, and spirit-led a voice, as Dr. Gaffney and others would describe for us. I love the way she says, the menfolk thought they could pack up the God tent, but they learned their lesson, right? I love that. What else do you hear in the text? Trent, up here up front. Kristen, I appreciate you helping out today. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, what I hear in the original text is a detail that was included that without detail, a small detail that was included without all the backstory that was probably assumed it would be innocuous by just interjecting this little detail. But as you scratch it, it raises questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love the process of Midrash, which trusts that there's more to learn than what's in the text. And that the spaces, I love that the language that Gaffney uses, the space between the letters is an opportunity for interpretation. Like what's not there? What about the word do you notice then is missing? And how might that missing invite in a holy way? She describes elsewhere in her book that it's true in black preaching more so than in white preaching, but this phrase, sanctified imagination, a black preacher. So even in a context in which the community would accept that the Bible is only literally true, it's inerrantly literal, that even in that context, the preacher would say, in my sanctified imagination, which lets the whole congregation know that we're going to go beyond the text and do something holy and religious without betraying the authenticity of the text. A preacher would never get up and say what I'm going to say in the sermon today, which is, I don't buy it. That would be irreligious. But actually, the religious process is to say what more might be said and to start with the text itself. It's a beautiful process. I'm just barely knowing anything about. Yeah. What else? What else do you notice about this, about Miriam, about Miriam's Midrash? What else? Can you see, even in the little taste that we've gotten today, can you see how easy it is for the biblical text to leave out stories that are worth hearing, stories that we can learn from? How do we learn the story that isn't told? How do we learn the story that isn't in the text? And this is part of it. And it's an ancient tradition. It's a very faithful religious, as she describes it, religious tradition that is interpretation through Midrash, which is kind of the creativity. Let the story evolve, even from what's not there. There are other approaches to Jewish interpretation, which is sort of to go sort of into more detail in the text. But the Midrash is kind of the beauty of the evolution of the story. What other comments would you share before we finish today? All the way in the back, Haley, thank you.
This really reminds me of the way my dad tells stories, too. It's like you're not sure, you're pretty certain that most of it isn't 100% true, but there is so much truth underneath it. You know that it's not a lie.
Yeah. I love it. There's a generativity to it. You know, yeah. Thank you. What else? Other comments about this? Yeah, Marthy.
It just seems like, to me, that you've got what Exodus says, and then you've got some ideas people have about how it might have really happened. But in the wrong hands, those fictionalizations are not provably true, or they're not, I guess in the hands of the wrong person, they could go way off track.
Yeah, then what would happen?
I don't know.
I don't know either. Yeah, I think that's a great way to sort of finish today, because it feels really threatening when someone takes a story that is in this book that we call sacred, the Bible, and begins to allow the story to evolve in ways that leave the text behind, what if it's wrong? Well, the answer is then we ignore it and we tell a new story. Right? That there's wisdom in the community, that the Spirit moves in the community. There are rules that have evolved through the community, and she names those rules. She's trained in this practice, but still mistakes are made, and if they're made, then we don't read that story anymore. Like, there are stories, let me make it even simpler. There are jokes that I heard as a child that I would never repeat. Not because they're not funny, but because I'm appalled that I was ever even told that story before, right? So it's not out of my memory, but it's no longer a part of the story that I tell. If we discover that a story isn't life-giving or godly, then we just stop telling it and we move on, right? I trust the community to figure that out. Now, it's also, what does it mean to have leaders who play a role that when they tell a story, the community is able to recognize how stories are being told and with what authority they're told. And so if I were to make it up and say you have to believe this, y'all would all know right away, BS, right? Y'all would call BS on that so fast, it would be the end of that. If I say something that challenges you, that's okay. We kind of know that. So I do think it depends on the community kind of knowing how it is that we do this and to share that process. But it's certainly a process, and it's a process that's evolved over literally thousands of years. And I'd say, if in the wrong hands, oh well, we'll figure it out. And we might not figure it out in this generation, but 3 generations from now, they'll look back and think, look what they thought they were doing, right? They didn't know what they were doing, and we move on. Because sort of the way God works among God's people is even bigger than that. All right, so it's strange. It's a strange thing we do, and it can be a threatening thing we do. Certainly it can be threatening to some of the voices and the traditions that heretofore have been the only ones valued or privileged. So we'll come back next week, and instead of looking at women from the Torah, we'll look at women from the throne. We'll keep doing this work a couple more times until Dr. Gaffney comes and sees us in March. I'm really excited about her visit. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. I hope to see you all next week. Thanks so much.